So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I want to start by being a little nerdy, okay? So I want to talk for a moment about the Lord of the Rings. Now, I love this story, as do some of you. It's a story about good and evil, about love and power, sacrifice and suffering. At the center of the story is Gondor, a kingdom without a king. The kingdom without a king falls into disrepair and is powerless to stop a great evil that is rising in the east. There are prophecies of a future king and the glorious restoration of the kingdom of Gondor to its full glory, but those prophecies have mainly been forgotten. Few still believe. Early in the story, we're introduced to a man called Strider, who's a ranger from the north. At first, he appears to be a very unkingly figure. But as the story progresses, there are these moments where his true identity comes out. And over the course of the 3 books which tell the story, we learn his name is Aragorn, and he's identified as the rightful heir to the throne of Gondor. When some people learn his identity, they scoff at it. Right? How could a king look like this? They refuse to believe. Some even actively resist. But by the end of the story, no one doubts that he is truly the king that they've been waiting for. The king who will stop the spreading terror and free all of Middle-earth from the shadow of evil. You know, when Jesus appears on the scene, he doesn't look like a king. Right? He's not born in a palace, but a barn. He's not born to noble parents, but to unmarried peasants. But he is the true king. He's the only one with the power to stop the scourge of sin and defeat the darkness of death. But most people don't recognize who he truly is. The Gospel of Matthew is written to clarify the identity of King Jesus. If you remember, the book opens with a genealogy, a royal family tree. Jesus not only comes from the line of Abraham, which means he's Jewish, but from the line of David, which means he has royal blood and can rightly sit upon the throne. The next set of verses assure us that Jesus will take on sin with all of its ugly consequences, and he will deliver his people. He won't be some royal figurehead, but a warrior king who liberates his people from everything that terrorizes them. Chapter 2 begins with a procession of wise men making their way to offer him gifts that befit a king, right? Gold and frankincense and myrrh. These are gifts valuable and precious. These men know royalty. They spend their days in the royal courts. In Jesus, these Gentiles see a king who not only saves Israel, but shapes the future of all mankind. Each of these stories clarify the identity of King Jesus. Now, why is this so important? Remember that Matthew is writing his gospel after the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus by the Roman government. For many Jews, this alone would have discounted Jesus' identity as king, right? Wait, you say he's the king, but he just lost to Rome. You say he's the king. If he were the king, Rome wouldn't be able to kill him. Right? If he's the king, he'd liberate us from the bondage of Rome. Or so they thought. They would have been quick to write off the identity of Jesus since it didn't fit their preconceived notions. Now, what about us? Do we see? Do we understand? And ultimately, do we submit to Jesus as king? This may seem irrelevant to us since we're not occupied by a foreign government. We're not ruled by an outside king. But remember that Jesus came to save his people not from Rome, but as we saw in chapter 1, from sin. And all of us, we're familiar with sin, right? All of us are intimately acquainted with sin. In fact, all of us, we're told, are held captive by sin. So the liberation that Jesus promises matters as much to us as it did in the first century to those who lived in Israel. See, these chapters are written to help us, to help you see the true identity of Jesus Christ. He is the promised Messiah. He's the King of Israel. He's the hope of the world. And seeing his identity should lead you to allegiance to his commands, confidence in his care, and commitment to his mission. So there are 2 ways that we see his identity in these verses. First, Jesus replays Old Testament history. He replays Old Testament history. So remember verse 13, it picks up with the wise men leaving Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. They'd been warned by God in a dream not to return to King Herod, not to tell him where the Messiah could be found. What happens next is a pattern that's familiar to those who have heard or read the Old Testament. An Israelite family goes to Egypt for safety. A group of Jewish baby boys is slaughtered by a paranoid king. And then through divine revelation, God prompts a return to the land from Egypt. See, this is the very same sequence of events that happened in the early days of the nation of Israel. Jacob, also named Israel, and his 12 sons, they went to Egypt. Why? They went to Egypt to escape a famine that was sweeping through their part of the world. They went to Egypt to escape death. After 400 years in Egypt, a Pharaoh comes to power who's terrified of the growing Jewish population, so he orders the slaughter of every male baby. One male baby escapes, named Moses, and decades later, God calls him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt back to the land he promised to give them. Jesus here replays the origin story of Israel. So in general, it seems to me that there's an important distinction between two things, between series and sequels. Okay, so many of my favorite stories are part of a series. But if we're being honest, few sequels are any good. Right? Often sequels, they're an addition to the story, not a natural continuation of the story. So what happens is somebody writes a book, somebody produces a film, whatever, it does well. It does well because there's a good story, but the story's over and they see the opportunity to make some more money. So they take the same characters and they crank out a sequel, right? Another story that has nothing usually to do with the first story. Usually it's not any good. But see, the difference between that and a series is a series, at least the best ones, they tell a single story over the course of a number of volumes, a number of episodes. Events that happen early on in the story, they actually find their meaning and their purpose, their culmination in the climax of the story. All of it leads to this single climax, right? So from the opening pages of the first volume, the story is going somewhere. See, when the events in Jesus' life, when they mirror earlier events in the history of mankind or the story of Israel, it's because they're the climax of those earlier events. They're part of the same series. And these early events, they prepare us to understand what's going to happen later in the coming of Jesus. What happened to Israel is preparation for what happens in the life of Jesus. These early accounts, what they do is they give us vocabulary. They give us symbols to help us better understand who Jesus is and what he came to do. So when Israel and his sons flee to Egypt to escape death, it prepares us for a similar event in the life of Jesus. Look at verse 13. It says, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" So Matthew ends the account of Jesus fleeing to Egypt by quoting from Hosea 11, verse 1, where God recounts the salvation of his people from Egypt. He calls the nation of Israel his son. He does it in Hosea, but he also does it in Exodus. Why does he do that? He's setting the stage back then for the coming of his true son, Jesus. The role Israel played poorly, well, Jesus would play that perfectly. Israel was to be a distinct people who were to shine as a light to the Gentiles, but they failed. In fact, what they usually did, though, was join the Gentiles in their idolatry and unbelief. But what they failed to do, how they failed to obey, where they failed to listen to their Father, Jesus, the true Son, succeeds. Why is this important? It's important because it assures us that Jesus is a fitting substitute who can pay the price for our sin. It also helps us understand that a right relationship with God doesn't come through national identity. We don't become Jewish. A right relationship with God comes through union to Jesus. Jesus is the true Israel, and we come to God through him. Now, besides identifying Jesus as the king, one of the main purposes of these early parts of the Gospel of Matthew is to show us that Jesus is creating a new people of God. In the Old Testament, in order to be rightly connected with God, in order to rightly worship God, you had to become part of Israel. But that was only preparation for the coming of the true Israel, the true Son of God, Jesus. He replays the history of Israel, but you'll see this in the coming weeks. He does it perfectly, so that we will understand this, that reconciliation with God comes through union with Jesus. We don't identify with Israel through circumcision and sacrifices, but we find our identity in Jesus through faith alone. So after Mary and Joseph, they escape with Jesus to Egypt. A wicked king orders the death of all male Jewish babies under the age of 2 near Bethlehem. We see this in verses 16 through 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and he killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. It's impossible to miss the parallel here, right, between what King Herod does and what Pharaoh did. During that time, Israel was in captivity in Egypt. Not only does this reveal that Israel has become like Egypt. Think about that for a second. Israel has become like Egypt. But it helps us see the coming of Jesus in similar terms to the work of Moses. What did Moses do? He led Israel out of captivity. He was raised up by God to be a deliverer. So in the same way, but even greater, Jesus has come to lead God's people out of captivity. He will lead us into a land of peace and blessing. Our years of wilderness wandering will one day give way to life and joy in the kingdom of God. In making this connection, it's interesting that Matthew doesn't quote from Exodus. There have been plenty of passages he could have quoted from, but instead he quotes from the prophet Jeremiah. Here's why that's interesting. Jeremiah lived at a different time than the time of the Exodus. Jeremiah lived during another dark period in Israel's history. He lived in Jerusalem when Jerusalem was defeated and destroyed by Babylon. And Jeremiah, during that time, he wrote that Rachel, and he uses her just sort of as a picture of the mother of Israel, the mother of the tribes of Israel. She weeps for her children who are either killed or taken captive. So the story of Jesus doesn't just retell the Exodus story. It also retells the exile story, the story of captivity and despair. Now the final part of the retelling is seen in verses 19 through 22. Where God reveals it's time for his son to return to the land of Israel. In the same way that Israel journeyed to the promised land during the Exodus, and Israel returned to the land after exile in Babylon, Jesus takes the journey back to the land. As we'll see in the coming weeks, his return, it parallels the story of the nation in a number of significant ways. But look at verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who thought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Now, one way that Matthew is establishing the identity of Jesus as the Messiah, as the King of Israel, as the true Son of God, is by showing how his life just retells the story of Israel. Israel's identity had always been tied tightly to the identity of its king. Now, that was great for Israel during certain times, right? When King David was there, King Solomon. It was painful during most of the other kings. But even the best of times under King David, really the pinnacle of Israel's history, does not compare to what they would experience when the promised king comes. Like, that's the message of the Old Testament from the very beginning. It says this, hold on. God says this to Adam and Eve, hold on, a royal son is coming, and when he does, the kingdom of God will begin, and it will abide forever. So we see Jesus' identity as he replays Old Testament history, but also Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. Now, Matthew is very conversant with the Old Testament. Right? His gospel begins with this genealogical retelling of what God did through Abraham, David, and during Israel's exile. He loves to connect events in Jesus' life to promises, prophecies, and stories from the Old Testament. His gospel is a powerful apologetic for Jesus as Messiah. He wants his Jewish readers to see that following Jesus is the natural outcome of believing the Hebrew Scriptures. They don't need to jettison all they know. All they know prepares them for who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. Now, in these verses, he's already quoted the Old Testament twice. Now he ends the chapter with a final reference, but this one is a bit different. Okay, first, it's not connected to the replay of Israel's history like the last two, right? The previous two references, verse 15 and verse 18, are about Israel's history. This one is not. Second, this one is not a direct quotation. So the first two were direct quotes from a single prophet. So they are easy to trace because you can go back to the scroll of Hosea and you can see where he says verse 15. You can go back to the scroll of Jeremiah and see where he says verse 18. But the third reference, verse 23, notice it quotes prophets indirectly. Now, because of this, there's lots of debate about what he's referring to. Look at verse 23. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, this reference is tricky because Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament. Did Matthew make a mistake? Did his understanding of the Old Testament fail him? Was he just in a place with no scrolls and just misremembered something? Well, no. I think he's actually doing two things. One is a play on words, and the other, he's showing how this choice of Nazareth, it fits with the Old Testament description of the Messiah. So first, let me explain the play on words. The word Nazareth, it sounds like the Hebrew word nazer, which means branch. Okay? Now, if you know the Old Testament, you're familiar with it, that should instantly sort of remind you of some things. Because the word branch, or the title branch, is used in multiple messianic passages. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, they all prophesy about someone who's the branch, or the Nazer. He's from the stump of Jesse. What's that mean? Well, it looked like the line of David had been cut off, that royal line, but from the stump, this branch would come. And this branch would blossom and bear fruit. One branch from David's line, his kingly royal line, would remain alive. And this branch, once it sprouted, would usher in an eternal period of prosperity for the people of God. And so there's this play on words, that Jesus is the branch. But second, the town of Nazareth had a reputation in Israel. It was a reputation for being backwoods. In the South, we would call it redneck. Do you remember this? When the apostle Nathanael was first introduced to Jesus of Nazareth, do you remember what he said? He says, whoa, has anything good ever come out of Nazareth? Now you might take that as maybe something bigoted or, man, what a jerk. But Jesus says, Nathanael, you're someone who doesn't lie. You're someone who just tells the truth. You're without guile or pretense. He said that because that was Nazareth's reputation. It was scorned and it was despised. So Matthew, he had read the descriptions of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and where many people read them and only thought about the victory, only thought about the new creation, only thought about those parts, Matthew noticed things like what Isaiah wrote, that the Messiah would be despised and rejected by men and no one would esteem him. Or what the psalmist wrote, that the Messiah would be ridiculed and insulted. And so what he sees this choice by Joseph to move to Nazareth, a despised and ridiculed little town, as a perfect fit with the description of the Messiah in the Old Testament. So Matthew, what he's doing here, he's laying out this clear and convincing case for the identity of Jesus. Is Jesus of Nazareth really the promised king? Is he truly the Son of God? Now these are important questions for all of us to answer. These are life-changing, eternity-shaping questions. Is Jesus who he claimed to be? Because if he is who he claimed to be, if he is who his disciples claim him to be, then allegiance to him is the difference between life and death, between freedom and suffering. Allegiance to Jesus is the single most important issue in the world and in your life. Have you settled this issue? You see, Christianity is not about following a list of rules. It's not about giving money to a church or being a moral person. It's about being self-rule and pledging your life, allegiance, and future to Jesus Christ. It's admitting that you have no right to sit upon the throne of your heart. In fact, you will just make a train wreck of it, and instead humbly and joyfully asking Jesus to take the throne. Christianity is about the rule of Jesus not only over the whole universe, but over your heart and life, over your choices and desires. So we see in this passage the identity of Jesus. He is the true king. Let me end by making a couple observations about the kind of king he is. You know, it's one thing to know who the king is, but it's another to know him personally. It's one thing to read the royal proclamations, but it's another to sit around his table. Jesus is king. But what kind of king is he? Is he the kind of king you want to follow? Two observations. First, King Jesus is sovereign, even in awful situations. King Jesus is sovereign even in awful situations. You know, the story of Jesus' kingship gets off to a terrible start, doesn't it? He's born in a stable, and he's laid to sleep in a feeding trough. Like, if you told me that was your parenting plan, I would not think you were a good parent. Like, I don't think you're prepared for this. His parents, they then have to flee the country to protect him from a homicidal king. When they finally are able to come back, they relocate to a backwoods town to stay safe. This isn't how anyone expected the Messiah to arrive. Has God lost control? Well, of course not. When we look back at it from this perspective, we see how every event was part of God's sovereign plan to reveal the identity of Jesus and his purpose for coming. You know, we often think we're in control. Right? Most days when our alarm goes off and we hit it 2 or 3 times, we then get up and we start to do what we planned on doing. Right? We plan to get dressed and eat breakfast. We plan to go work or school. We plan this and that. And most of the time, we do what we planned. But there are days when everything goes wrong. Right? Some days when the thin veneer of control that hides our true inability, it splits wide open. We aren't in control. And at that moment, 1,000 different things could happen that we cannot expect or explain or prevent. I think in those moments, we think God is like us. We think things spin out of control for him sometimes. But he's not like us. He never loses control. The moment is never too big for him. God has never placed his hands in his head and said, now what? Not when the inn was full in Bethlehem. Not when a murderous king ordered the execution of innocent little babies. At no point was King Jesus in over his head. In fact, look at verse 20. Jesus returns to Israel when those who sought the child's life are dead. Jesus always outlasts his enemies. Everyone who stands against Jesus comes to the very same end as we see in verse 20. Jesus is alive and ruling long after they are in the grave. Earlier in this passage, Matthew quoted from Jeremiah 31 about Rachel weeping for the kids who were killed and taken captive in the exile. For many Israelites, if there was ever a moment when God seemed to have lost control, it would have been when Babylon marched in, defeated and ransacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. But as the women of Israel wept and mourned, God was still on the throne. The verse which follows this verse he quotes, the verse which follows the description of Rachel weeping in Jeremiah is this, Jeremiah 31:16. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. In their suffering, God had not forgotten them. He would bring them back. They would be restored. Later in that very same chapter, we find the promise of a new covenant that God will make through the death of his Son. He would wipe away their sin. He would give them new, clean hearts, and his Spirit would make his home not in a temple, but in them. See, in the darkest moments, God is still at work. This has been a tough year. I mean, for some families in our fellowship, it's been a tough week. But don't for 1 second forget that Jesus is still King. He is still sovereign. He is the one who turns mourning to dancing. He interrupts funerals with resurrection. Jesus is sovereign even in awful circumstances. Second, King Jesus is sympathetic to outcasts and exiles. Does more of the Bible take place in the castle or on the run? I think if you were to read through the Bible, you'd find out much more of it takes place on the run. God's people are exiles and pilgrims. Just like Jesus, this world is not our home. Ever since we lost our home in the Garden of Eden, we've been wandering. Though we may vote in the election and hang out the stars and stripes, our true citizenship is not found in this country. Brothers and sisters, we are citizens of heaven and wandering strangers on earth. Have you ever decorated a hotel room? Like, have you ever checked in your room? Oh, Mr. Wredberg, room 321. And you pull up the U-Haul, start unloading your furniture. We don't paint and put art on the walls of our hotel because we're not living there. We're simply passing through. But how many of us spend the best of our time, our energy, and our money on making ourselves comfortable in this life? How easily do we forget our status as exiles? You know, when the Apostle Peter wrote his first letter, he addressed it to the elect exiles. Why? So we don't forget who we are. If our king was an exile, why do we think we should make ourselves at home? Do you see that material comfort can blind you to the heartbeat of Christianity? From the very start, Jesus shows us that we shouldn't get too comfortable here. Because we're exiles, we should have a soft spot in our hearts for those most overlooked and afflicted in our world. Now, we have this human tendency that we've got to fight against. We want to be around winners. We want to be accepted by the successful. But as exiles, we should look for those who've been cast out and forsaken, and we should care for them. This is why we should care about issues like abortion, racism, poverty, immigration, pornography, adoption, foster care, a host of other things that affect the most vulnerable. This is where our heart should bleed towards those overlooked, afflicted, and forgotten. You know, as a church, God has given us a great gift this year. In a very small way, He has let us feel that we're exiles. Right? Our normal home was lost to us. And we've been wandering. We've been homeless. And now here we are, we're experiencing the Jesus-like generosity of Fairview. They have opened their home to us, requiring nothing in return. What a gospel picture. Their generosity to a homeless church, us, should inspire us to be generous to others. Who are the outcasts and exiles in your life? Who is overlooked and afflicted? Who is hurting and alone? You know, this Christmas season, it's a wonderful time to show them compassion. What could be more like Jesus than to care for those who've lost everything? Last week at Thanksgiving, my father-in-law, he shared the story of his father with a family. And there was one part of it that really stuck with me. So his dad, Don, my wife's grandfather, he grew up with a Christian mom but a non-Christian dad. And though he went to church at times as a boy, he entered high school as an unbeliever. One of his classmates, Vivian, she had a strong and vibrant Christian testimony. And even though he was not a Christian, he noticed it. Well, one day while he was in high school, the report came that she had died in a car accident. And God used her life and witness to bring Don to faith. Don ended up going to seminary, becoming a pastor, raising his kids to know the gospel. And so there we sat at the Thanksgiving table, years now since Don died. Don's oldest son, his spouse, his three kids, grandchildren and spouses, 8 great-grandchildren, all of whom faithfully go to church, know the gospel. So we can look back now and see the death of Vivian impacted an entire family, 4 generations and counting. Do you think in that moment, Vivian's family would have known all that God would do through her tragedy? Here we are, 70 years later, multiple states apart, and her name's being mentioned. Would they have any clue how God would bring such goodness out of such darkness? No, they wouldn't. But see, we as believers, we should see this and not be surprised, because the gospel story is the story of a king, yes. But he's a king who's born into the darkest moments. He's born into difficult circumstances. He's exiled by a bloodthirsty king. He's ultimately executed by a cutthroat government. And then what happens? The grave can't hold him. He rises from the dead. The rejected king is placed upon the throne of the universe, where he accepts all who come to him by faith. The world now belongs to the exiled baby. Do you know him? Do you worship him? Does your allegiance belong to him? Father, I pray that you'll help us to see that in this story of tragedy, it's a story of your good and profound and sovereign work. And maybe right now we're dealing with some tragedy of our own. And we don't see yet how you will bring good out of it, but let us look, Father, at what you did with your Son. The circumstances he entered, the situations he endured, and yet all of this was to bring us to you, was to bring many sons to glory. And may we be encouraged to trust this King, even in the darkness, even the difficult circumstances, when we can't see what's next, when our identity as exiles and outcasts is heavy and it's hard and it's difficult to bear. May we find hope in Christ. May we find confidence in the exiled baby who now reigns over the universe. Help us not to lose hope, but to put our trust in you, our allegiance to King Jesus. We pray all of this in his name and for his glory. Amen.